Welcome to the Roundtable Perspective. I'm your host, Lee Artz. I'm joined today by my guest, Dr. Ranjodh Dhaliwal. Dr. Dhaliwal researches game design, corporate tactics, critical digital studies, theories of media and technology, and issues of race, class, and technical production of identities. Today we're going to be discussing citizen science gaming and citizen participation in scientific research, especially a recent publication called Join the Fold, Video Games, Science Fiction, and Citizen Science. I want to start, Dr. Dhaliwal, by, in the article, it noted that scientific researchers spent 10 years looking into the monkey virus, but the gamers solved the problem in 3 weeks. It's like, whoa. I mean, I know gaming is really advocated as something that will benefit mankind, but this seems, that seemed extraordinary. In 3 weeks.
Yeah, I mean, and initially when those differences were outlined, it was pretty revolutionary for the scientists who were researching protein structures. But then that's the power, I think, in some ways of, having more people.
Yeah, it would seem like the more people that are collaborating, the more people that are doing research, the more you're apt to find something, because individuals will be more creative or more observant than somebody else. Even a scientist that has laid out all the protocols isn't necessarily going to see every single thing, but it's incredible to me. I thought maybe we could begin by just having you explain what should we understand citizen science? Mm-hmm. What does that mean, citizen science?
So citizen science in some ways can be understood as any kind of practice where regular citizens who are not always and usually not professional scientists themselves, nevertheless contribute to actual science in some way. Layman astronomy or whatever in pre-modern eras. So you're probably a citizen scientist before you were a scientist. Yeah. As a profession, science itself comes at a certain time in our history. But citizen science has had a huge sort of emergence and popularity, and has gained popularity over the last few decades, more specifically as a way of involving the public in actual scientific research, and then also sort of thinking about science communication and the way that the loops between science and society actually function.
It's basically what you're saying is that the citizens are invited to participate in some research activity. It may not be a full scientist that's trained, precisely, but they still, I think of that myself when there's a birding thing, and I can go out and identify a bird and take a picture and send it in, and somebody's collecting this greater data that I'm only contributing 1 or 2 birds to, but I'm still participating and making a contribution to, the species that still exist in the area. So that makes sense.
Absolutely.
The next question would be, how does that end up in gaming? Mm-hmm. Fold It, which was an attempt to find protein, mm-hmm, and how they fold over onto each other, which again, I'm not a scientist, so I'm not sure what that means, but could you talk a little bit about Fold It as a game, mm-hmm, and what it was intended to do?
Right. So Fold It as a game comes from the series of sort of simulation procedures and softwares known as Rosetta. So what happened in 90s and 2000s is that scientists, biologists and chemists who work with proteins started realizing that computational tools are very useful for visualizing how proteins locate what's the optimal protein structure, right? So you would know the chemical composition of a protein, but you wouldn't know how exactly it's arranged, like where are the hydrogen element or where are the carbon atoms and so on and so forth. And so simulation softwares were created. That was step 1. Step 2 was that it was realized that, well, you can have the computer find the lowest energy states, right? Like you and I would not know if there's hundreds of atoms what the lowest energy state would be, by naked eye, but the computers can permutation and combination try to figure that out. What happened then was that in the era of sort of like outsourcing this work on individual computers. So I don't know if you've used SATI at home. There were all these softwares at some point of time that would use the unused power on your computer and help feed that power to compute these things that the scientists needed for their research.
So a biologist or a chemist would be looking for this question, and then they would have other people that had the same program available on their own
Precisely.
home computer, and they could kind of run the program.
Exactly.
Okay.
But people started calling in and saying, if you have the visualization in front of me, that the computer is just taking the wrong turn. It's going to lead to more clashes between these two branches of the protein, and it actually should have gone the other direction. So, a blind permutation combination wasn't working, and therein entered Foldit. So Foldit was designed as a game, a citizen science game, which would allow players to sort of rotate and manipulate protein structures.
They could actually use the game, and if they see something happening with the protein and they don't think it should, they can somehow
change it themselves using tools.
Yes, okay.
And so what that means is that thousands of players around the world at the same time can be looking at the same protein and feeding data back to the scientists about optimal configurations.
And those thousands of people may be responding to that protein or the development of that protein in different ways, but all of those are sent back to the scientists, and from that the scientists can say, oh, this works, or that doesn't work, or this is a good path.
Absolutely. So to give you a recent example, during the COVID, there were a bunch of COVID puzzles that related specifically to the proteins that are involved in either us finding out more about the virus, or us finding out more about the possible vaccines that we could create, and so on and so forth. And all of that stuff was going out to the Foldit players, who were then responding sort of really quickly to these calls to action. And that's where the sort of power of gaming and that of citizen science as this aspiration comes in together in Foldit.
Okay, the essay that I read, Join the Fold, Video Games and Science Fiction, indicated that at a certain point, the producers or the scientists that were running Foldit thought that they could improve the experience by creating a science fiction narrative. So there would be characters which would seem to attract and provide more enjoyment for the gamers. How did that come about, and what was the intent of this?
So I think the intent of this can be seen two ways. In one way, it was simply a way we wanted to understand whether providing a narrative structure to what otherwise is just standalone puzzles actually changes your incentive or your desire to contribute and move forward the storyline or solve the next puzzle and so on and so forth. Because we had a not insignificant attrition rate, so a bunch of people were
People would start and then they would drop out.
Right, I mean, these are, not easy puzzles. They look weird. Like, why am I doing this? I thought I was done with my organic chemistry classes.
Go bing, 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 bing.
Yeah, indeed. So that was one goal that we wanted to test, whether the presence of stories actually helps
people keep them engaged.
Indeed.
To continue the research.
Precisely. As we started designing this, we were more invested in was how exactly do players understand themselves and their relationship to science as they engage with these stories. So, through player interviews or through data that you get, you can try to understand why do people play? What do they think science is? What do they think they're contributing? How exactly do they see the relationship between science and society?
And it's probably like other games that have a narrative. It generally tends to be science fiction if it's not a shoot 'em up. But the science fiction narrative is something that attracts people because science fiction is a popular genre in entertainment anyway. So if you have characters that follow some narrative, we're looking for this, we're looking for that, here's a problem we have to solve, and along the way, it improves the engagement of the gamers.
Precisely. And science fiction as a genre has inherent qualities that help contextualize science as a practice, as a project, as a set of techniques out there. As you pointed out, it's also very popular. And science fiction always has the what if scenario, right? It always thinks about this in speculation, which basically means that there's a lot about the world that you can find out and that you can convey that are not solely always
it's
bound.
not there. It doesn't always exist at the very moment that you're asking the question, but the possibility is there.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And so it's also an aspirational call in some ways.
One of the things I noted, you said that the narrative, the science fiction narrative, improved engagement, but
Right.
there also was a level some of the participants didn't want that because they just wanted to get to doing the research, right? You can imagine somebody that's kind of,
Right.
prone towards research, and it's not play, it's really,
Right.
the work is the play.
Yeah.
So how do you make sense of this? So you have science fiction narrative to keep some of the gamers there,
Right.
but there's other gamers that say, knock it off, we just want to get to the work.
Indeed, indeed. And some of these games are also actively used in classrooms, for example. So one could imagine it having a different relationship sometimes.
So if you're in a high school biology class, you might be using this game, or
Right.
even a early college class. It's to keep
Right.
the engagement without.
Precisely.
Yeah.
So you may already be like, I don't need this. I just need to click through or whatever. I need the puzzles. But I think that basically tells us in some ways something that scholars of game studies, which I'm one of, but so are a bunch of my co-authors here as well. I should say all of this work is as much mine as it is by other team members at University of California in Davis, University of Chicago, and Northeastern University in different departments and different areas. But one of the things that emerges in that understanding is that there's no one kind of gamer, there's no one kind of player, there's no one kind of science enjoyer. There are many kinds of people that you're reaching out to, and each one.
So the science fiction narrative, the intent was to attract people that weren't necessarily just attracted to the scientific research and are just going to stay with it.
Right.
But to keep those people that are attracted to the game and the science fiction, even though they're told
Yes.
this is for science,
Yes,
they're more apt to stay and play
indeed.
if there's a narrative that
Indeed.
backs it up.
Though it's also entirely possible that you are there because you initially thought that, I want to play this game to contribute to science, but then you're like, well, now I'm bored, and now I need something else. And so maybe this is the hook.
So this is what the science fiction overlay does, right? You create certain characters, like Amina was one, which is a robot, and what was it? Octavia was another.
Yeah.
Barney, I read down in there. So one of the things you claim about the narratives is that it helps gamers reflect on practices and promises of citizen science.
Mm-hmm.
How do you know this? I guess what's the evidence that by playing the games, the gamers actually learn more about the idea that citizen science is a social good, so to speak?
Right. So let me actually start with the fact that right now with the advances in AI, there are actually specific kinds of computational techniques. We recently had AlphaFold, which was a AI system that could also manipulate the molecules and find out optimum protein configurations. It works in some kinds of proteins better than others.
Does that have a narrative as well? Or
No, but the reason I bring that up is because even if one were to assume a world where I don't need citizen scientists to help me solve protein configuration puzzles quickly, there is still a world in which citizens can understand and know what's happening in the scientific world through other means than going on Scientific American and reading about it or something of that sort. In this particular case, we ran studies. We had controlled sort of studies, including anonymous interviews with different kinds of players. We had expert opinion from different kinds of playing audiences. And then we ran a sort of anonymized A/B test across several new players that were coming into Foldit, because every week a bunch of new players join and want to contribute to science. Many of our interviews told us very explicitly that the themes in the narrative and the way that the game was designed was actually feeding in and making citizens reflect on their own relationship with science, with society, with technology, with artificial intelligence.
Because of these aliens, like in Foldit, the aliens show up and they basically want to use the humans as food.
Right.
And so the idea that there's aliens that have this opinion of humans and humans have an opinion of the aliens, it moves you to reconsider what's your relationship to animals or to Muslims or to, right?
Precisely.
Yeah.
It's a narrative of difference, right? Which is why the specific experiment that we're talking about here was called Foldit First Contact, which explicitly references and thinks about tropes of first contact, which come from science fiction, but before that actually came from the colonial encounter.
Yes, you would come in your first contact with the natives.
Precisely. So in this case, it's an alien invasion story trope that is sort of turned on its head midway through the narrative. I won't give spoilers, but essentially a large part of what's happening here is miscommunication and how you think about the other. So whether it's us thinking about other peoples or us thinking about the other machines or animals, it's a story about difference that makes people think about their relationship with the machine that they're collaborating with in that moment to contribute to science, which is in some ways mirroring what's happening in the story.
What you're actually doing by playing the game,
Precisely.
Foldit.
Yeah.
And I would just point that our viewers could probably go online and type in Foldit and be directed to the game.
Absolutely. You should do it.
Yeah, you should do it. There's some things, I asked the question about disguising and concealing the scientific purpose, and you point out that Foldit doesn't do that. People know that they're playing a game that has a scientific purpose to find out about the proteins. But it does raise other questions for me about citizen science research, like I do all this research or I participate in it, is now given to Pfizer so that they can have a copyright and make a world of profit, or does it go to the researchers that are actually making Foldit, and then they become entrepreneurs and they start their own business to create this, the protein, the development of the protein, or does it belong to the public? I mean, citizen science would seem like, well, if the citizens are doing the work, then the outcome of that research should be owned by the citizens. It should be accessible to citizens. They should determine how it's going to be used. So how does Foldit or your whole approach to citizen science address these questions?
Yeah. No, I think it's a really interesting and fascinating question that is itself very complex and has many angles. So let me point out a couple of things in here. One, I think the origin of citizen science itself can be contextualized within the larger schema of generally stagnant or decreasing scientific funding within the American context and global context more broadly over the last few decades.
I'd say when I read the piece, you talked about colonialism and imperialism, and one word that didn't show up was capitalism, which is in the United States, when you're talking about the current status of scientific funding, it's corporate controlled or it's government controlled for a corporate purpose, which seems to undercut the whole idea that we should collaboratively participate in collectively finding what we need to know as humans or as other for the benefit of nature.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I think so you have to sort of contextualize the sort of kind of neoliberal hollowing out of the scientific funding apparatuses if you have to account for what happens outside, what happens downstream of that, right? So citizen science can be many things, one of which is coming to terms with how exactly to manage in the present society the labor configurations of all the work that needs to be done for science when you don't have enough people in the room to do it. At some point of time, you could write a Ph.D. thesis on just finding the configuration of one molecule as a scientist yourself, right? And so if you have the newer tools and also you have less funding, you're going to have to reorient your priorities.
Is that how Folded, is that how the researchers kind of moved in that direction because there's a lack of funding? So one of the ways is to involve citizens in the research?
I mean, I'm hesitant to comment on that in this specific instance, but by and large, if I were to take a step back and think about citizen science as a whole, I would say that that's one of the factors that is involved, though not the only one. I think what's key here, and this is something that we foreground in this project more specifically, is using these techniques and these practices that are already prevalent to actually critically examine and have the players who are involved in it, or citizens who are actually learning about it, use that to think deeply about their relationship and about these issues, right? I mean, that's why the issues of colonialism and imperialism are right in there. I mean, the issue of capitalism is in there because you already own a computer. So, it's implied in some ways, but I think you raised the right point. It's also a question of like, what is your responsibility within what exists today?
I mean, these are questions of social relations, which when we think about technology and YouTube and Google and Facebook, that somebody owns that,
right?
And they make the decisions. We seem to enjoy it.
Yep.
I mean, what do they call them? Prosumers. You had a word in here.
Playbor?
Playbor, which means Playbor means.
You think you're playing, but you're doing labor at the same time.
You're doing labor for somebody else.
Yeah, for somebody else.
Yeah. But not in the case of Folded.
Not necessarily, and not in the same way. So Rosetta is a large scientific organization that is splayed out across many academic institutions that forms the scientific and the infrastructural back end of what is Folded, and then Folded First Contact on top of it. So it's a layered system, and even the question of sort of intellectual property there is pretty complex. But I would say that there have been sort of several, sort of public outcomes, including, scientific papers in Nature that players were cited in, the players who helped find those structures. So there's several ways of looking at it.
Not the same as being in a movie, but you do get recognition.
Yeah, I think it's more about working with what we have and then being able to raise those questions as players, right? So one of the things that our experiments showed us that players were actually pretty good at realizing the kinds of relationships, the social relations that they were embedded in consuming this narrative and in doing this gaming.
One of the things that's implied, and maybe you may even have addressed it precisely, is it raises a question for me: how does gaming, as a practice, as a participant, move us from distraction and the little rewards that you get for making, you move to the next level, you find this out. How does it move from that to a conscious participation in citizen democracy, not just citizen science, but how does that gaming participation move people to beyond the rewards, the immediate rewards, right? To the idea that I need to be concerned about the world in which I live. I need to be concerned about the common good. I need to be concerned about others, not just the gamers that are with me, but how does it do this?
I mean, I think here one needs to make a distinction between gamification and play as it happens, right? So humans have been playing forever. But gamification, the idea of having levels, rewards, those things that tantalize you and as a result keep you hooked because you have a notification on Facebook or something, is a far more recent and bizarrely predatory practice, right? So one of the things that we think gaming can offer, because again, humans have been gaming before gamification was a thing, is to basically harness those creative, playful impulses that we nevertheless carry with us for other means. So competitive gaming is not the only way. Like the only way to understand the world is not like I win and somebody else loses. It's not like
there are collaborative games.
Precisely, right. And there are games where collaboration is the goal, right? So where the goal is not you will win and I will lose. The goal is that we only can win together.
Yeah, if we don't win together, we're all going to die.
Precisely, which is the game that we are in the global world.
And it seems to tap into the whole human interest. Curiosity. how does that work? Why does it work? What does it mean?
Yeah.
And that. Thank you, Dr. Dhaliwal, for joining me on the Roundtable Perspective today. I'm Lee Artz. I will see you next time.